Tonight, before the world around you sinks into its usual silence, I want to pull you into the strange journey of ketamine, a story that, at first glance, looks like the tale of yet another laboratory compound. But the deeper you follow its trail, the more it becomes a mirror of human desperation, ambition, and the eternal attempt to outrun suffering. What began as a small, odourless liquid born under fluorescent lights and military pressure ended up drifting through battlefield dust clouds, slipping into nightclubs pulsing with neon haze, and finally settling into the calm white rooms of modern mental health clinics. Its life started as a soldier's shield against agony, then morphed into a doctor's tool, later a toy of party kids chasing visions, and eventually a fragile rope for people trying not to drown in their own minds. From surgical chaos in Vietnam to the sterile experiments of 21st century psychiatry, this molecule crossed decades twisting science, warfare, and madness into a single thread, proving how often humanity tries to dull pain and accidentally dims reality itself. And because the algorithms demand their ritual, hit the like button, subscribe if these stories are your kind of insomnia, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time the clock is whispering in your room. The 60s were an age when pharmaceutical labs acted like factories of small miracles and catastrophic miscalculations in equal proportion. And inside one of those buildings, where the smell of burnt coffee clung to lab coats, a cluster of chemists worked on something they hoped could calm wounded soldiers without sending them into the afterlife. The Second World War had left a planet stitched together with scars. The Korean conflict had stretched those wounds, and Vietnam was already looming as the next theatre where anesthesia would be as crucial as ammunition. Field surgeons knew they would be forced to cut into bodies surrounded by mud, insects, gunfire, and screaming, and the last thing they wanted was a soldier waking up halfway through what felt more like an accidental autopsy than a rescue. Park Davis, a US pharmaceutical company accustomed to making remedies for every ache and guilt imaginable, set out to design a kind of sleep that wouldn't kill the sleeper. Their efforts produced a delicate little structure labelled C58, a chemical speck full of promise. The oddity was that nobody fully grasped what it actually did. It pushed patients into a strange twilight, knocked out but not gone, physically still yet staring as though witnessing their own operation from that unreachable place above the ceiling beams. Scientists scribbled terms like perceptual detachment and dissociative state, which was their polite way of saying the mind stepped outside of its body and watched doctors move around like actors in a cheaply lit stage play. And even with all that strangeness, regulators approved it, because compared to PCP, which turned patients into violently unpredictable furniture, C58 looked like a chemical guardian angel. Human trials began around 1966, and what unfolded could have been directed by Fellini himself. People waking up laughing at jokes no one had told, others insisting they had been dead for a moment, and a handful describing luminous beings that looked suspiciously like anesthesiologists wearing halos made of fluorescent reflections. Once the Vietnam War ignited, the US Army adopted ketamine as if it were a long-awaited miracle. Fast, reliable, indifferent to the absence of oxygen tanks, and best of all, cheap. The vials travelled in medics' backpacks next to gauze, morphine and tourniquets, becoming the emergency exit for countless young soldiers shredded by explosions. Surgeons injected it as the ground trembled from artillery strikes, and the wounded drifted into a floating calm, watching their own suffering from some impossible vantage point above the carnage. Many survived the physical wounds, but returned home staring blankly at the horizon, as though a slice of their soul had stayed behind in a cloud of Mekong humidity. In those cramped medical tents, doctors started to notice something unsettling. Ketamine dulled the memory of pain, but it also smudged out pieces of ordinary life. Some soldiers described an overwhelming calm, as if their minds had dissolved into warm water. Others spoke of cosmic wanderings where time softened and melted like cooling wax. The military dismissed these reports as side effects, hippies baptized them as ego-dissolving liberation, and newspapers, armed with their signature misunderstanding, summarized it all as the drug that disconnects you. The irony is that almost no one wanted to connect with it at first. Ketamine entered the world with the reputation of a veterinarian's invention, and by the 70s it was widely used on horses, dogs, and primates. But the more people shoved it into barns and animal clinics, the more curiosity it stirred among humans. Psychedelic culture in that era was hungry for anything promising transcendence without incense or gurus, and ketamine offered an out-of-body guarantee with no spiritual membership required. In the psychological underground, researchers viewed it as a cosmic joke, an anesthetic that woke up entire inner universes. Scientists tried to decode its behavior. It blocked NMDA receptors, cutting off the brain's glutamate signaling, essentially flipping the main switch between self and world, a controlled blackout of reality. And in an age filled with static, war, and relentless noise, the possibility of not feeling anything for a moment became its own temptation. Years rolled on, and what started as a tool for amputations in steamy jungles quietly transformed into the seed of a psychiatric revolution. Without realizing it, those doctors in Vietnam had cracked open a doorway in human perception, a drug capable of silencing agony without erasing consciousness, blurring the barrier between real and imagined. Every decade afterward would claim ketamine for new purposes, as a scientific puzzle, a spiritual elevator, a recreational escape, or a lucrative commodity. Yet in that early moment, under the flickering bulbs of a military tent where humidity clung to metal instruments and the air smelled like sweat and antiseptic, no one imagined that the clear liquid in those tiny bottles would become the world's most efficient passport out of the body without requiring death. Science labelled it a dissociative anesthetic. Soldiers nicknamed it rest. And eventually, the rest of the planet came to recognize it for what it truly was, the most elegant method humans had devised to disappear while continuing to breathe. Vietnam became the accidental laboratory for nearly every madness that shaped the 20th century. Napalm, helicopters thundering like angry gods, psychedelic rock pouring out of stolen radios, trauma curling through entire generations, and ketamine drifting like a ghost through the smoke-heavy air. In that landscape where the jungle seemed to bleed and the rain fell so thick it blurred into clouds of steam, little C-58 perfected itself as the only anesthesia fit for a hell that had no real operating rooms at all. The field surgeons, their boots swallowed by mud and their skin chewed by swarms of insects, learned to place more faith in that clear, silent liquid than in any whispered prayer, because a single injection could turn a soldier who had just lost a limb into a motionless figure with a faint, eerie smile that chilled every doctor's spine. They didn't fall asleep, they simply drifted elsewhere. Medical reports from those years described cooperative patients with serene, almost holy expressions. But the truth was far stranger. They were hovering above their own bodies, watching the surgery unfold as if the whole scene was some grainy, poorly projected film. Officers praised it as a pharmaceutical miracle, doctors muttered that it was an enigma, and soldiers, always honest in their own brutal way, called it a journey. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a man with his abdomen open thanking the surgeon in a soft, peaceful voice, as though he were receiving a gentle massage instead of losing a piece of himself. Ketamine didn't just mute pain, it blurred the line between terror and indifference. That was why the military adored it and feared it simultaneously. It was efficient, unquestionably, but it left invisible fingerprints on the mind. Months later, many veterans remembered flashes, bursts of white, the sensation of observing their own bodies from the tent's ceiling, or the echo of their breathing sounding like it belonged to someone else entirely. Some swore they had felt a profound tranquility right in the middle of chaos, and that tranquility stalked them afterward like some strange spiritual narcotic. The army, ever practical, ignored the philosophical implications and focused on logistics. Ketamine allowed medical teams to complete hundreds of surgeries with fewer resources and in less time, and bureaucrats adore anything that saves money. But in the veterans' hospitals, psychiatrists began to notice a different pattern. The men who had been anesthetized with ketamine seemed strangely disconnected long after they returned home. They didn't show sadness nor pain, but neither did they show joy. It was as if the substance had carved a silent fracture inside their identity. "I feel nothing," many of them would murmur without emphasis, and that flat confession marked the quiet birth of a chemically sculpted version of post-traumatic stress. Ketamine had helped them stay alive on the battlefield, but at a cost. It refused to let part of them fully return. In the following years, pharmaceutical corporations sifted through Vietnam's medical records with a mix of fascination and guilt. realizing they had stumbled upon something capable of extinguishing human suffering without destroying the body, only to discover that the price of that mercy was memory. Post-war experiments collected testimonies that sounded almost sacred. Volunteers describing tunnels of radiance, drifting outside their own flesh, or feeling merged with the entire universe. Others recounted frozen nightmares where everything was quiet, hollow, and full of echoes. Doctors who once worked with scalpels and morphine now found themselves facing a metaphysical question. What exactly is consciousness when the body takes a step back? Ketamine didn't answer. It simply left that same distant smile on every face it touched. While scientists wrote articles and generals signed procurement forms, the soldiers who had unwillingly served as test subjects returned to a homeland that no longer made sense to them. Many sought refuge in alcohol, others in LSD, and a small number gravitated back to ketamine, which had begun slipping out of the military and into civilian shadows. What had been a battlefield anesthetic was slowly mutating into a passport to oblivion. Underground clubs in San Francisco and New York started obtaining stolen medical vials, and what once kept young men alive in jungle surgeries turned into the favourite toy of the counterculture. No one grasped it yet, but the same molecule that kept Vietnam soldiers from screaming would soon be numbing an entire generation desperate to escape reality. War, scalpels, and amnesia. 3 words that define the decade when human beings discovered that not feeling could become more addictive than feeling too much. Once the helicopters stopped rattling the treetops and the medics packed away their needles, ketamine had already fulfilled its patriotic duty. It had quieted horror. But wars do not end with peace treaties. They end when boredom sets in, and thousands of soldiers returned home with minds, half-dimmed and pockets holding a prescription for a drug that made the body disappear. In the 70s, while the United States tried to drown Vietnam's memory beneath disco rhythms, free sex and colourful pills, someone noticed that this transparent surgical fluid could be evaporated, inhaled, and used to turn a dance floor into a spiritual operating room. It was the hangover of war, those same young men who had been conditioned to not feel now chase sensations without suffering. In California garages, stolen vials of ketamine began circulating among musicians, artists, and alternative therapists who insisted they had discovered a molecule of transcendence. The psychedelic scene, already loyal to LSD and mescaline, welcomed the newcomer with open arms. It offered the same inward journey without cosmic snakes or bouts of nausea. The body stayed behind, light as an abandoned shell, while the mind rose slowly like a balloon drifting into dim starlight. The first clubs to embrace it were improvised temples of strobe flashes and artificial fog, and in those neon sanctuaries ketamine earned its first mystical nickname, something harmless sounding, almost breakfast-like, though its effects were far closer to an out-of-body experience than a balanced morning meal. The people who used it in those years would whisper that the ground melted under their shoes, that minutes folded in on themselves like soft metal, that they could hold conversations with the version of themselves trapped inside a mirror. It was the American dream chopped, sifted, and remixed into a pale, weightless powder. The army's syringes morphed into spoons and credit cards, operating rooms morphed into clubs, and the stretches of battlefield chaos became dance floors trembling under subwoofers. Doctors watched with a horror sharpened by guilt as their invention drifted from saving lives to dimming minds for entertainment, while magazines printed in somebody's basement praised it as a kind of spiritual reboot, a total disconnection with allegedly no downside. Lies, of course, but lies the public was happy to swallow. It was a decade where everyone was running from something: government, family, their own skin, and ketamine offered a sanctuary that required neither ideology nor belief. Humanistic psychologists, always hungry for some new chemical revelation, began experimenting with tiny therapeutic doses, insisting it allowed patients to confront their traumas without dragging the weight of flesh into the room. In some offices, people dissociated so deeply they forgot why they had come in the first place. Emotional anesthesia had mutated into a philosophy. The boundary between medicine and mysticism dissolved into a floating white cloud. From military hospitals, the molecule slipped into the communes of Haight-Ashbury, drifting effortlessly from trenches to tie-dye dreamlands, and the transition was so seamless that no one noticed the tectonic shift. Ketamine was no longer a surgical tool but a godless religion, worship of the void itself. The body, that stubborn biological inconvenience, could lie sprawled on a sofa while the mind waltzed with imaginary galaxies. Clubs in New York, London, and Berlin embraced it like the ideal fuel for a style of pleasure that was more cerebral than physical. And under those neon halos that made the night feel like a futuristic lab experiment, a new generation discovered addiction not to joy, but to nothingness. The soldiers in Vietnam had lost contact with reality by accident. Now people were doing it on purpose. A substance born to dull the wreckage of flesh was beginning to dissolve the meaning of living. Parties echoed with talk of entering the K-hole as if it were a holiday destination, some spiritual excursion that required no luggage. Some emerged refreshed, others returned with pieces missing. The battlefield hangover had transformed into an invisible epidemic, humanity learning to cure itself by unplugging, convinced that the modern way to feel alive was to stop feeling entirely. The 80s arrived wrapped in neon, humming with electrons and the plasticky smell of a promised future, and cities filled with synthesizers, impossible hairstyles, and young people who had traded ideals for the throb of bass lines. It was the decade of the body, yet paradoxically also the decade of abandoning it. And there, beneath black lights and artificial smoke, ketamine found its final shrine. What had been battlefield anesthesia and psychedelic experiment now hardened into a nocturnal religion. Underground clubs in London and New York began mixing it with MDMA, cocaine, and techno, an alchemy of powder, sweat, and trance. People danced with eyes shut, oblivious to time, as if every heartbeat were a glitch in the simulation. In that atmosphere, the K-party was born, a collective ritual of vanishing, where everyone pretended to be vibrantly alive while hollowing out from the inside. Dealers carried translucent packets with the precision of pharmacists and spread their contents over mirrors bathed in violet light. No one mentioned anesthetics or side effects. Instead, you heard talk about inner voyages, ego exits, descending into tunnels, entering that white abyss that now circulated in conversations like a mythical destination. Ketamine, with its promise of instant dissociation, crowned itself as the most philosophical of black market substances. It didn't stimulate or depress. It suspended. It didn't flirt with pleasure, but with emptiness. It was the perfect commodity for a generation that had lost faith in everything, except the need to experience something, anything. Rave magazines dubbed it a mystical anesthesia, flavoured with neon, and DJs morphed into priests of disconnection, each beat acting like a scalpel slicing open consciousness and letting gravity seep out. In Manchester, Berlin, Amsterdam, crowds moved as if participating in a mass surgery ceremony, blessed by deep bass vibrations and lasers threading through the smoke. No one remembered the military surgeon who first tested ketamine. The rhythm had become the blade, and pain had turned vintage. The music industry adopted that anesthetic aesthetic: glossy album covers, translucent bodies, digital sweat, while fashion copied the gestures of the dissociated: vacant eyes, pale skin, trembling lips. The whole planet appeared to drift in slow motion, though the glow of fluorescent powder carried a cost. Many who dived into the K-hole did not return the same. Some lost their sense of direction for hours, others for days. Emergency rooms began filling with rigid bodies sporting crooked smiles, slow but steady heartbeats, brains still dreaming while paramedics shook them gently, trying to reignite consciousness. Yet in the language of nightlife, this wasn't danger. It was achievement. You went far, people would say, pride soaking their voices. Delirium became status. The deeper the fall, the truer the pilgrimage. Ketamine was the perfect substance for an era that confused intensity with enlightenment, and as mornings rose over chemical hangovers and fractured memories, rave culture continued worshipping that glowing dust, convinced that disappearing was the purest form of existing. Anesthesia had become an aesthetic, silence a beat, emptiness a creed. Under the neon altar, humanity danced itself blissfully out of being, applauding its own dissolution in strobe-lit ecstasy. After its swift reign in military tents and subterranean dance floors, ketamine stumbled into an unexpected new life, the stable. By the early 80s, when human doctors began to distrust it for its habit of sending people into orbit without a return ticket, pharmaceutical companies decided to rebrand it. The product had to keep selling, just with a different audience. And so the same liquid that had muted the agony of wounded soldiers was repackaged and shipped as veterinary anesthesia. The bottle changed shape, the label shifted tone, and the miracle molecule that once shielded soldiers from agony was suddenly rebranded as a remedy for jittery horses, anxious cows, and dogs terrified of the sound of a metal table in a veterinarian's office. The packaging now carried the words, "for animal use only," a warning that of course had the opposite effect because nothing ignites human curiosity, quite like a substance stamped with a sign saying hands off. The forbidden always tastes like medicine. In the suburbs outside New York, in the shadowy labs of Berlin, in Bangkok's market alleys where everything illegal glows like treasure, the reimagined ketamine began circulating with its new aura of scientific outlaw status. Teenagers called it the horse cure. College students joked that it made you gallop through your mind, and the more pretentious circles defended it as a primal, animal-style form of transcendence. The truth was simpler. People didn't understand how something created to tranquilize foals could make a human feel like a drifting deity. The secret lay in its ferocity. Ketamine formulated for animals had to be swift and flawless, because a half-ton horse doesn't grant you a second chance if it wakes up too soon. That brutal reliability made it irresistible to humans searching for a fast and supposedly safe escape. Within seconds, consciousness melted into a warm, sticky calm. The body settled into a lukewarm statue, and the soul, if such a thing existed, seemed to take a quiet break without asking for leave. Veterinarians unintentionally became suppliers of the new counterculture. Some vials vanished from storage rooms without explanation. Others were sold at golden prices in the basements of clubs and private parties. And thus a perfect contradiction was born. The more ketamine was associated with animals, the more human its reputation became. Sensationalist magazines renamed it the horse drug. Tabloids fabricated stories of parties full of scalpels and syringes. Universities conducted discreet studies behind locked doors, and every time a news anchor mentioned it with trembling concern, clandestine sales spiked overnight. Prohibition turned out to be the best marketing campaign. Meanwhile, in the labs, scientists watched with exhausted resignation as their invention slipped yet again from the hands of science into the mythology of urban nightlife. The absurdity was that ketamine still worked flawlessly no matter who, or what, took it. In veterinary operating rooms it put tigers and rhinos to sleep without so much as a tremor, and in human clubs it sedated souls with the same precision. In both worlds eyes froze, bodies went still, and minds hovered in a pale limbo. The evolutionary loop had completed itself, from soldier to horse, from horse to poet, from poet to partygoer, and from partygoer to psychiatric patient. The molecule adapted like a species with its own survival instinct. To some it was anesthesia, to others revelation, and to many an elegant excuse to stop feeling. Between the hospital corridor and the strobe-lit dance floor, ketamine found its truest identity, a substance that belonged to no one and served everyone. The boundary between animal and human blurred inside the same vial, and while governments debated whether to ban it outright or hand it out with a prescription, half the planet was already inhaling it, convinced that if it was strong enough for a horse, it must be perfect for escaping oneself. When the nightclub lights began to flicker out and hospitals stopped ordering it by the box, ketamine drifted back to the only place where it had ever been safe, the laboratory. It was the early 90s, and scientists were suddenly interested again in that strange liquid capable of numbing without knocking out and healing without fully being understood. What had begun as a wartime experiment and later become a neon-soaked party trick now turned into an existential riddle. What exactly happens in the brain when the person you are no longer stays attached to you? The earlier studies on dissociation read like philosophical essays disguised as scientific reports. Researchers noticed that ketamine dimmed certain regions of the cortex without dragging the patient into sleep or coma. The body stayed still, but the mind wandered through an inner ocean full of images, voices, distortions, and spectral echoes. The subject is aware, yet absent, one report from the National Institute of Mental Health noted, as if describing a ghost haunting its own skull. In other words, the person didn't lose consciousness. They stepped out of reality. Neuroscientists were entranced, because it felt like watching someone flip the exact switch that controlled the sense of self. Brain scans revealed that NMDA receptors were being blocked, preventing the signals that tied together identity, memory, and presence from flowing. It was as if a cable connecting mind and body had been unplugged, leaving both pieces resting separately on the table. Test subjects described floating above their own bodies, seeing themselves from an external vantage point, or travelling through glowing landscapes where time had no structure. For believers, this was proof of life after death. For scientists, it was pure neurochemistry, but the line separating those interpretations grew fuzzy. In psychiatric conferences, ketamine research triggered applause rather than scandal. Experts discussed controlled voyages, induced out-of-body simulations, even experimental prototypes of what they dared to call models of the soul. Some labs tried to measure those subjective experiences like vital signs, using dissociation scales that read like astrological charts for the mind. Degree of separation from surroundings, intensity of internal floating, clarity of inner vision. Volunteers, torn between fascination and dread, described tunnels of light, metallic hums, and the unnerving sensation that their bodies were hollow shells left behind. For the first time, science treated what once had been dismissed as hallucination with respect, and the deeper they investigated, the more enigmatic the molecule became. In the years that followed, neurophysiologists and psychologists began treating ketamine as a kind of spyglass pressed against the mechanisms of perception itself, trying to understand why a brain that had slipped loose from the world insisted on manufacturing alternative realities so persuasive they felt more authentic than the one people were born into. Some suspected this phenomenon might illuminate near-death visions, mystical awakenings, or even the profound stillness reached in deep meditation, but the more they tried to frame it in rational terms, the more the whole thing throbbed with unease. At Yale, researchers conducted experiments in rooms that smelled of latex and cold metal, asking volunteers to describe sensations that many likened to dying without payment of the usual consequences. The scientists simply smiled, wrote neat notes, and repeated interesting with academic detachment, as though they hadn't just heard a metaphysical confession disguised as clinical data. The phrase dissociative anesthesia cemented itself in medical literature, too graceful to call delusion, too precise to call sleep. Meanwhile, psychiatrists were drawn to a different mystery. Certain patients who tried ketamine under medical supervision reported feeling strangely relieved afterward. Not euphoric, just less heavy, less drowned by sadness. That single spark of improvement ignited an entire field of neuropharmacological speculation. Perhaps they thought dissociation wasn't a side effect at all, but the mechanism of healing itself. Maybe the mind needed to unplug to restart. Speculation hardened into hypothesis, hypothesis into industry, industry into marketing promise. The world was about to learn that a molecule forged to silence the screams of soldiers and horses might also whisper hope into people who had forgotten what hope felt like. But before becoming psychiatry's accidental miracle, ketamine made one final stop in the underground, a phase where science and madness moved together under a pale white glow, a trance in which the brain dimmed itself without dozing off, convinced that losing control meant finally understanding something. The 90s arrived coated in digital optimism, with war turned into television programming, and ketamine slipped into quieter spaces, artist studios, alternative therapy sessions, bedrooms where loneliness disguised itself as spiritual hunger. The molecule once designed for bloodless amputations became, without intention, the balm for a generation that couldn't stand their own reflection. It was no longer about fleeing combat, it was about running from the empty room inside one's skull. Painters, musicians, writers, photographers discovered that a tiny drop could turn perception into a philosophical kaleidoscope. Reality scattered into shards, colours drifted as if underwater, sounds loosened from linear time, thoughts floated without hierarchy or gravity. In conceptual art circles, the experience morphed into aesthetic ritual, an opportunity to observe existence from outside the body, as though one's life were a temporary installation exposed under gallery lights. Critics defended this trend with elegantly hollow sentences about self-dissolution as creative gesture, though beneath that intellectual lacquer lay a simpler truth. Ketamine quieted emotional suffering with a precision no therapy session could match. Urban mystics embraced it as a vehicle for transcendence. In improvised Californian temples, self-appointed gurus mixed the liquid with incense, chanting, and promises that this chemical flight was a door into the soul, and in certain ways it was, though the doorway didn't always lead somewhere gentle. Some travellers found peace, others found abysses. In that uncertain territory, the line between meditation and self-erasure vanished. People drawn to suicide stared at ketamine with a cold fascination. It did not kill, but it demonstrated with eerie clarity how death might feel. It became a rehearsal for disappearing. In diaries and anonymous forums, unsettling testimonies circulated. I dissolved and realized I don't matter. I died, and it was beautiful. I left myself and everything made sense. Universities reacted predictably, with grants, ethics committees, and new research protocols. Why could an anesthetic provoke mystical revelations? Volunteers were scanned, their serotonin mapped, their glutamate charted, their brainwaves captured, but no graph explained the tears they shed upon returning. The truth was simple. Ketamine wasn't just a drug. It was a faceless mirror. It lifted you out of the body, yes, but it also suspended you in the gap between who you were and who you might have been. Bold therapists began using it as a tool of emotional excavation. In controlled rooms, people relived traumas, spoke with earlier versions of themselves, forgave ghosts that still clung to their ribs, or simply vanished for a while from the weight of being flesh. Anesthetic turned into confessional. In this new cartography of consciousness, ketamine stopped being a substance and became a metaphor. The desperate search for affection without the burden of a body, for peace without biography, for existence without pain. Scientists named it controlled dissociation, but to those who experienced it, the term felt too cold. They described it as the attempt to reconcile with a world that no longer seemed real. Artists created under its glow, philosophers wrote about emptiness, musicians composed songs that floated without gravity. Culture itself became ketaminic, bright, fractured, shimmering, emotionally numbed and trembling like a dream that refuses to end. On the edges of that cultural wave, a few users began confusing enlightenment with a final escape, mistaking transcendence for disappearance. They had tasted nothingness and decided they preferred it to the burden of returning. Love, guilt, sorrow, every human emotion felt crude beside that soft white quiet. That was why people whispered that ketamine was the drug of impossible love, not because it stirred desire, but because it taught a person how to exist without needing anyone. It was anesthesia for the soul during an era when feeling anything at all had become unbearable. Pharmaceutical companies, which in the 70s had watched their experimental anesthetic leak out of the medical system and into the hands of rebels and dreamers, returned in the 90s with a new mission: reclaim ownership. It was the golden age of Prozac, the decade of emotional marketing, the seductive promise that happiness could be stuffed into elegant capsules with pastel branding. If an antidepressant could sell hope, why not sell transcendence too? And so began the feverish quest to tame ketamine. In the labs of Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer and dozens of ambitious smaller firms, chemists resurrected the old molecule, convinced they could repurpose it into a sanitized form of ecstasy, a drug that could lift the weight of sadness without conjuring visions or moral hangovers. What they didn't understand, or pretended not to understand, was that they were no longer working with a medicine, but with a white void carved into consciousness itself. Every attempt to shrink its mythology into a pharmaceutical pamphlet failed. In clinical trials, volunteers reported impossible things. I watched my childhood from above. I met myself and thanked me. I finally understood silence. Researchers took notes, adjusted dosages, and smiled with tight jaws. The results were always the same. Yes, depression faded, but so did the need to belong to anything, and you can't patent that. Still, investors threw millions at the project. They talked about nasal sprays, refined versions, mirror molecules. They invented esketamine, ketamine's obedient laboratory sister, a chemical twin advertised as offering the benefits without the mysticism. They marketed it as a rebirth in pharmacology, but in truth it was a chemical exorcism. Their aim was to drag the soul out of the substance and keep only what could be monetized. Studies filled with graphs charting the reduction of depressive symptoms, increases in neural connectivity, improvements on the Hamilton scale. No one mentioned the other effect, the one questionnaires couldn't measure, the sensation of having visited a place that didn't exist. In university hallways, some researchers quietly referred to it as the God drug. Executives clenched their teeth whenever they heard that phrase. The stock market has no appetite for spiritual side effects. And while financial reports overflowed with soothing corporate vocabulary, back in the labs, technicians watched patients emerge from anesthesia with tears in their eyes. Some said they felt healed, others claimed they felt hollow. The disconnection business was back, wearing a white coat this time, but nothing quite fit together. Ketamine continued to mock its creators. Too low a dose did nothing. Too high a dose erased the patient. Analysts wrote non-linear response, a polite way of admitting the molecule behaved as if it had its own will. And so, while pharmaceutical giants fantasized about a future of miracle sprays and motivational advertising, reality slipped between their fingers. You cannot domesticate a substance engineered to dissolve the self. In their attempt to sell serenity, they manufactured oblivion. In their quest to bottle hope, they patented indifference. Stocks soared, stocks collapsed, and patients drifted in and out of themselves. In the laboratories of broken dreams, science discovered it had reinvented the anesthesia of the soul and wrapped it in the language of progress. They say no one forgets their first ketamine trip, even though during the experience one swears the opposite. It isn't fainting, nor dreaming, but something more cunning, a full suspension of reality where the body becomes a rumour and consciousness becomes an observer. In psychiatric clinics and nightclubs alike, people describe the same moment, the instant when ketamine erases the axis binding the brain to the universe. First comes a wash of calm, a lightness in the legs, a faint electric hum behind the eyes. Then gravity surrenders. The body stops being yours. You dissolve into the air like a statue melting in warm rain. Some call it peace, others call it a rehearsal for death without the tragedy. Medical reports describe it with cold precision. NMDA receptor blockade, reduced thalamocortical connectivity, disruption of somatic perception. In human terms, the brain stops receiving signals from the body and invents new ones. That is why patients float, multiply, or travel into landscapes stitched from light. One can become cloud, vibration, wall, or God. There is no pain, no time, no flesh, only a white silence. Anesthesiologists learn to recognize that vacant gaze in hospitals. Still pupils, a faint smile, mechanical breathing. "He's in the hole," they would murmur. In parties the line was identical but spoken with pride. "She went into the K-hole." For some it was revelation, for others a cosmic prank. Clinical reports sometimes read like science fiction stories. A man who, after minor surgery, insisted he had spoken with his own body from the ceiling. A woman who, during a recreational overdose, described an endless staircase of light, where each step erased a memory. A veteran asking for another dose because the void was the only place where guilt couldn't reach him. And everyone, no matter their story, agreed on one thing. Once you return, the real world looks smaller. The K-hole doesn't kill, but it leaves scars no scan can detect. For minutes, or centuries, depending on the mind inside it, a person loses every anchor. Up and down dissolve. The senses melt into one another until sounds glow, colours whisper, and language drips like liquid echoes. Some travellers feel bliss, others taste raw panic. The unpredictability is part of its curse and its charm. Scientists tried to map the void with electrodes and MRI machines, but the data was as baffling as the testimonies. A brain cut loose from its body starts generating a universe of its own rather than fall into nothingness, an act of survival disguised as hallucination. Researchers named it internal model emergence. Poets called it astral wandering. Paramedics simply labelled it a problem, but no one denied its gravity. Death and ecstasy blurred into one indistinguishable line. Veterans of the experience developed rituals, soft music, dim lighting, a friend watching just in case the body forgot to breathe, because logic has no authority in that space. You might feel years passing only to learn it was a minute. You might think you've returned while you're still lost inside. The strangest part is that upon waking, many claim they learned something enormous, yet they cannot say what it was. It's the sensation of brushing against some immense truth that collapses the moment you try to describe it. When the brain resets, it deletes most of the journey to protect itself. It's a deliberate amnesia, and yet the desire to go back never disappears. The K-hole becomes a philosophical addiction, a doorway into nothingness promising answers no one remembers. Some compare it to the womb, others to the tomb. Perhaps both are the same. In any case, welcome to the place where the body ceases to exist and the mind plays God for a few borrowed minutes. No one knows whether you emerge healed or shattered, but everyone agrees. After the whole, the world never feels solid again. When science surrendered and Nightlife turned it into a sacred object, ketamine took an unexpected leap. It migrated from syringe to altar. In the 90s and early 2000s, inside lofts lit by candles and apartments perfumed with synthetic incense, a new kind of priest appeared, the urban shaman. No feathers, no drums, just latex gloves, ambient playlists, and a box of vials bought on the dark web. Where medicine saw an anesthetic, they saw a key for cracking open the third chemical eye. Dissociation became a spiritual rite, a controlled pilgrimage into emptiness, a baptism with no deity. Alternative psychologists, exhausted by patients repeating their traumas like broken rituals, started experimenting with supervised microdoses. Sessions took on a theatrical quality: warm lights, guided breathing, speeches about ego and energy, and then the injection. Within seconds, the patient slipped out of the body and entered perfect silence. Therapists called it identity reboot. The more poetic ones said rebirth. Cynics called it an overpriced nap. In truth, ketamine had replaced the old rites of ayahuasca, peyote, and mushroom visions. It promised the same revelations without vomiting or jungles, enlightenment conveniently scheduled during office hours. Meanwhile, New Age dealers updated their sales pitch. They weren't selling drugs anymore. They were offering powdered transcendence. The business of anesthetized spirituality exploded across social media. Coaches, influencers, self-taught therapists posted their ketamine ceremonies as casually as others advertised detox tea. Except here, the detox was for the soul. Participants spoke of symbolic death, of crossing the void and returning purified, though in reality all they crossed was their own central nervous system. But words have power, and soon wellness clinics in California, Mexico, and Thailand began offering ketamine retreats at 5-star pricing, premium spirituality with guaranteed disconnection and optional Wi-Fi. While marketing promised safe voyages to the subconscious, indigenous shamans watched with a mix of amusement and sorrow. It had taken thousands of years for Westerners to understand the medicine of trance, and when they finally did, they turned it into a customer service package. But ketamine was no obedient spirit. In makeshift rituals, participants sometimes remained stuck in the hole longer than expected, mistaking ego dissolution for enlightenment that never arrived. Still, the myth swelled. Fame-hungry psychologists, calm-seeking executives, Silicon Valley widows, artists in crisis, everyone wanted an appointment with the chemical oracle. Self-help magazines declared it a sacred experience of emptying out. The more grounded physicians called it molecular hypnosis. The irony was brutal. After millennia of praying to connect with gods, humanity invented a substance that eliminated feeling entirely and labelled it spirituality. Ancient rites chased inner fire. This one aimed for blackout. But in a century where anxiety was religion and disconnection paradise, ketamine fit more naturally than any creed. In the modern laboratory of the soul, every session promised the same trinity: silence, erasure, and the fleeting illusion that for a moment nothingness had meaning. And so, anesthesia became prophecy, a god with no body, no voice, and no judgment, asking only one sacrifice: to vanish. At the dawn of the 21st century, when the world had mastered the art of prescribing pills for every emotion, ketamine returned wearing a lab coat and a halo of legitimacy. After decades of being dismissed as a club chemical and a veterinary tranquilizer, psychiatrists dusted it off and christened it with a new identity: rapid treatment for resistant depression, a rebirth for a substance that had survived 3 wars, 2 reputation collapses, and more mystical odysseys than anyone could count. Tonight, the hospitals of the United States, Europe, and Asia began carving out silent white rooms where no one came to dance or flirt with death, but to beg for the simplest thing imaginable: to stop wanting to die. Depression clinics filled with people who had swallowed every antidepressant on Earth, from the old SSRI dinosaurs to the shiny experimental prototypes, all without relief. What they were promised now sounded almost mythical. An intravenous dose of ketamine, and within hours the weight dragging their souls underwater would lift. No Prozac, no therapy marathons, no meditation apps. Just a needle. It looked like sorcery, and the media framed it that way. News segments parading patients who smiled for the first time in years, doctors describing neural resets, pharmaceutical executives quietly calculating the windfall. At last, the unruly molecule had become profitable. But beneath the applause lurked a puzzle no one could fully solve. How could something engineered to switch off consciousness rekindle the desire to live? Researchers spoke of neuroplasticity, synaptic reconnection, emotional recalibration, technical flourishes hiding something much simpler. For a few precious hours, people stopped feeling imprisoned inside themselves. The effect was quick but slippery. Many patients returned weakly, chasing that brief corridor of light, that chemical ceasefire between them and the abyss. Private clinics multiplied like franchises of salvation. Brochures whispered promises like, "Reclaim your life in 40 minutes," accompanied by pastel images of peaceful faces, soft lamps, and ambient music, a pharmacological spa for the soul. But not every physician joined the celebration. Some warned the human brain wasn't designed to visit the void every Monday afternoon. Others feared the line between treatment and dependence would blur faster than anyone could admit. They were right. Patients weren't only seeking relief, they were seeking the tiny dissociative shimmer that came with it, the instant when the body vanished and the mind floated clean and unburdened, almost holy. The industry called it a therapeutic effect. The patients called it rest. Then came the nasal formulations, sleek and profitable. Ketamine, sold as Spravato, became the emblem of the new century, an antidepressant that didn't heal so much as offer reasons to continue trying. The FDA approved it with triumphant headlines, and the press welcomed the comeback of the drug that had unplugged half the planet. Meanwhile, inside treatment rooms, patients kept describing the same visions as their predecessors. Tunnels, light, ego dissolving. What had once been a mystical journey was now an appointment with billing codes. Psychiatrists rationalized it with bar graphs, and patients answered with tears, because although the sadness softened, something deeper still refused to settle. Ketamine didn't return meaning to life, it simply wrapped the emptiness in silk. But in a civilization exhausted by speed and panic, that was enough. Clinics multiplied like hope-themed coffee chains, reclining chairs, dim lights, binaural music, nurses with scripted smiles. It was modernity at full power, transforming nothingness into a business. And so the drug born to dull battlefield agony found itself fighting a different war, one fought quietly inside millions of skulls, minds that could no longer tolerate their own existence. As psychiatrists hustled to publish studies and pharmaceutical companies printed glossy pamphlets about the modern cure for suffering, a new elite discovered ketamine could be more than treatment. It could be a luxury. In Silicon Valley, where emotions were just productivity variables and breathing required monthly subscriptions, the wealthy began paying thousands to disconnect in clinics that resembled sci-fi spas, leather recliners, golden lighting, ambient arpeggios drifting through hidden speakers, and a smiling physician who, for $3,000 a session, would let you mute the universe for 40 minutes. They called it intravenous enlightenment, a phrase as absurd as it was lucrative. Entrepreneurs who had built digital empires on stress and algorithms now sought through a needle the silence their own inventions had stolen from them. Rebooting the soul's operating system became the fashionable expression. It sounded spiritual without frightening investors. Ketamine evolved into the emotional refresh button of a generation that mistook calm for a software update. In those temples of corporate wellness, the ritual followed a strict choreography, a symbolic medical assessment, a carefully measured infusion, a playlist of ocean waves and glass chimes, and therapeutic guidance from someone with an intentionally vague title like neurocoach or facilitator of expanded states. During the drip, patients felt their bodies dissolve while their smartwatches displayed beautifully flattened stress curves. Social networks blossomed with post-ketamine selfies, faces lit with artificial serenity, captions like, "I'm back in myself," hashtags proclaiming just inner reset. It was capitalist spirituality distilled to its purest form. Pay to disappear for a while. Return with your ego polished. Some used it to fight depression, others to survive their own success. A CEO admitted in an interview that each session helped him detach emotionally from corporate stress, meaning he could fire employees without guilt. Private retreats served ketamine between cold-pressed juices and meditations guided by synthetic voices. "This isn't a drug," declared a San Francisco brochure decorated with a minimalist logo and a fabricated quote from Buddha, "It's technology for the self." Traditional therapists were horrified, but markets don't trade in ethics, they trade in trends. And ketamine had everything a trend requires: novelty, glamour, and immediate results. Tonight, the startup world, where sleeping is treated like a software bug and emotions are considered inefficient energy drains, embrace spiritual anesthesia as a badge of elite refinement. The same men who once bragged about microdosing LSD to code faster now boasted about injecting ketamine to dull whatever human weight slowed them down. Some wrapped it in mystical language, others called it focus. But in that glass and chrome culture, the border between inner growth and premium escapism evaporated completely. Clinics adapted quickly, offering subscription tiers, 6 infusions, post-journey coaching, and access to curated communities of consciousness explorers. Inspirational slogans hung on their walls like corporate commandments: "Your mind is the new hardware." And in a twisted way, the logic held. Humanity had spent centuries trying to build a machine capable of dimming the soul without extinguishing the body, and Silicon Valley had finally turned it into a delivery service. Intravenous illumination was nothing more than chemical mindfulness, rebranded for executives, the same obsession with optimizing, sorrow, turning emptiness into output. Only now the silence cost as much as a car, and still the waiting list stretched for months, because nothing seduces the modern rich like the chance to feel human for a few minutes, anesthesia included. Somewhere between the rise of office yoga and the trend of intermittent fasting, someone realized ketamine could be marketed better than happiness itself, a medical ritual scented with redemption. And so the ketamine clinics were born, temples of chemical wellness where disconnection came with receipts, anesthetics, and background ambience. The United States became the epicenter of this white light fever. In under 5 years, more than 500 private clinics opened their doors promising the same reward: fast, safe, scientifically blessed relief. Behind the slogans were recliners, LED halos, lavender diffusers, and nurses who spoke in meditation tones. Each session cost between several hundred and $1,000 and lasted just long enough to erase the soul without damaging the branding. Patients, eyes closed and veins connected to transparent tubing, drifted into the void while a therapist murmured lines about surrender and flow. It was capitalism recast as therapy: pay to vanish for a moment, return with a receipt for emotional alignment. Social media filled with images of futuristic clinics selling nothingness as luxury. "Here you don't sleep, you're reborn," announced Miami franchise. Another in Los Angeles offered mood-tailored trips complete with Coldplay-adjacent playlists. Anesthesia became aspirational, and like every trend, it needed its profits. Enter the influencers of numbness, ex-models, digital gurus, wellness coaches, each recounting their first infusion as if they'd visited Nirvana by rideshare. On YouTube, videos titled "My Clinical Ketamine Experience" racked up millions of views, tearful thumbnails drenched in violet lights, captions declaring, "It changed my life in 40 minutes. Brands jumped in immediately. Perfumes, teas, magnesium supplements, everything began advertising itself as ketamine-inspired. A whole aesthetic emerged around the high. Soft typography, pastel tones, dreamy stares. Depression wrapped in design. Wellness entrepreneurs launched clinic chains with app-like names: Mindlift, Innerwave, Float. Behind the minimalist logos hid the same retired anesthetists and impatient psychiatrists who had discovered in human desperation their most reliable revenue stream. Some clinics introduced monthly memberships, 6 sessions, psychological follow-ups, referral discounts. Loneliness became a loyalty program. Insurance companies soon joined, covering part of the treatment. What had once been taboo became tax-deductible. Tech corporations purchased infusion packages for employees, deciding it was cheaper to sedate the workforce than to fund therapy. And every article in the media repeated the same line: a revolutionary alternative to modern suffering. No. One mentioned that the effects lasted only a handful of hours. Chemical wellness spread like a religion without doctrine, where every client was both believer and offering. Disconnection became just another product in the emotional marketplace: fast, clean, lucrative. Influencers sold it as freedom. Patients consumed it as rest. Doctors defended it as science. But beneath all that branding, everyone was chasing the same thing, a silence that didn't hurt. And ketamine, with its clinical elegance and promise of temporary nothingness, delivered exactly that. It didn't heal, it erased. It didn't enlighten, it dimmed everything with style. In a century drowning in noise and anxiety, that was enough to fill every waiting room. Clinics advertised it as treatment, doctors as progress, patients as redemption. But somewhere between the needle and the exhale, the edges started to warp. Our ketamine, the polished sibling promising to cure depression in 40 minutes, began leaving behind an echo that too many mistook for need. Tonight the old nightmare resurfaced wearing a polished modern disguise, a problem so familiar that everyone pretended not to recognize it, as they lined up for another dose of engineered silence. In those immaculate treatment rooms, white walls, eucalyptus diffusers humming softly, ambient music designed to never fully resolve, patients began asking for just one extra session, then another and another, until the weekly schedule looked less like therapy and more like ritual devotion. Doctors referred to it as therapeutic maintenance, a delicate phrase meant to avoid the far uglier word everyone sensed lurking beneath. Yet a single glance at the patients leaving the clinic told the truth without needing textbooks. Pupils drifting like slow moons, half smiles that didn't belong to the present moment, that vacant softness in the face of someone who has spent too much time detached from themselves. In medical files, curious patterns started appearing. Cases where nothing improved, yet no one wanted to discontinue the treatment. They whispered that without the infusion, everything felt too sharp, too heavy, too painfully real. Psychiatrists tried fine-tuning the doses, relatives surrendered to the routine, and the patients quietly continued chasing the one instant when the mind unhooks from the body and the world finally goes mute. "It's the only thing that quiets me down," they said, with the sincerity of the ill and the devotion of a believer. Some began injecting themselves at home, ordering vials online with the same casual ease others ordered supplements. On anonymous forums, strangers exchanged tips about needles, playlists, breathing rhythms, recommended body positions for sliding deeper into the void. Science watched helplessly as its clinical experiment slipped back into folklore, because the whole, that suspended territory without gravity or meaning, does not forgive curiosity. What begins as relief mutates into dependence, not on the chemical, but on the delicious sensation of not existing. And no chart has ever cured that. Hospitals soon reported episodes of ketamine-induced psychosis. People claiming they had spoken with the ceiling, watched their thoughts drift like luminous jellyfish, or glimpsed the architecture of the universe before forgetting how to return to it. Clinics denied everything, of course. Their websites continued displaying glowing statistics and photos of smiling patients bathed in warm light. Business does not acknowledge limits, especially when the product being sold is hope. At medical conferences, presentations started sounding suspiciously like motivational seminars. Ketamine not only reconfigures neural pathways, it opens new dimensions of medical spirituality, speakers proclaimed, avoiding any mention of memory gaps, prolonged dissociation, or patients who came back more absent than before. Meanwhile, out on the streets, recreational use surged again. At festivals, the white powder circulated disguised as modern medicine, and countless users referred to it as therapy without the therapist. Whatever boundary once existed between science and delirium dissolved completely. Protocol turned into habit. Cure turned into routine. Some psychiatrists, behind closed doors, admitted what the data refused to hide. We've created people who don't want to heal. They just want to disconnect better. And they were right. In a world sinking under its own weight, ketamine offered a refuge too perfect to resist. Humanity once again confused relief with redemption and silence with salvation. Under neon lights and beneath white lab coats, the line between medicine and the abyss stretched thin as a vein. Things turned grotesque when ketamine left luxury clinics and resurfaced inside ambulances, strapped to the wrists of its newest victims. What began as a battlefield anesthetic and was reborn as an antidepressant became, in the 21st century an instrument of control on American streets. Emergency protocols authorized paramedics to inject it in cases of severe agitation, a definition so broad it could describe a psychotic episode or simply a terrified citizen. A few seconds of resistance during an arrest was enough justification for a dose originally calibrated for tranquilizing horses. The media labelled it chemical restraint. Families called it something else entirely: chemical killing. Courtrooms discussing police brutality began to echo with unfamiliar phrases: ketamine administration, respiratory collapse, excessive force. More than once, autopsies revealed that the victim hadn't died from bullets or batons, but from an overdose administered amid sirens, asphalt and panic. Medical examiners cited misjudgment. Activists called it execution. Across the country, videos and reports accumulated, paramedics injecting people without consent while officers held them down, bodies that never woke again. The same substance once advertised as treatment for despair became synonymous with chemical coercion, the sedative of choice for a system eager to quiet the inconvenient. Doctors protested. Officers defended it. The irony was nauseating. A drug invented to spare soldiers from battlefield agony was now being used to silence unarmed civilians. In court, attorneys quoted FDA documents describing ketamine as safe and effective in clinical environments. No one mentioned that clinical environments do not include handcuffs, pavement, or knees pressed into windpipes. With each new scandal came the same pattern: doses given without examination, medics following police orders, altered reports masking responsibility. In one landmark case, a young black man in Colorado was pinned by 4 officers and injected with 500 milligrams of ketamine. He died on the way to the hospital. His name joined a growing list, a list that transformed a once miraculous anesthetic into a national symbol of institutional violence. The networks burst into storms of hashtags while newsrooms staged their outrage, and police departments released frost-cold statements about reviewing procedures, and in the middle of that public theatre, the makers of ketamine stayed utterly silent, reminding everyone in carefully sanitized language that their product was intended only for medical use, though the boundary between treatment and force had long since been shattered. Paramedics trained to guard life had been reshaped into unwilling executors for a system that found it easier to shut down a person than to hear them. At medical conferences, a few specialists suggested rewriting the protocols, while others, blunter, more jaded, proposed creating a more predictable version of the drug for law enforcement use: anesthesia elevated to policy, involuntary sleep repackaged as public order, the age of disconnection finally discovering its ideal instrument, a molecule capable of erasing resistance in seconds. Most disturbing of all was how casually it was discussed. In formal reports, deaths were reframed as complications from sedation. Online debates split between those who blamed misuse of a therapeutic tool and those who knew the issue was never the substance but the authority wielding the needle. The outcome remained identical: an absolute hush. The war anesthetic had completed its loop. From battlefield to operating room, from club to clinic, from clinic to patrol car. The drug that once allowed half the world to disconnect willingly now disconnected people by force. And while cameras captured another chemically muted arrest, humanity relearned the same old lesson. Whenever reality becomes intolerable, someone will always be ready to sell a dose of oblivion or administer it uninvited. Inside neuroscience labs, ketamine stopped being a romantic puzzle and became an experiment wired with electrodes. What patients described as drifting or euphoria appeared to scientists as an electrical glitch, a brain still issuing motor signals long after the conscious mind had stepped out. The contradiction was chilling. Under its influence, subjects could lift their arms, react to simple cues, even hold their eyes open, yet later swear they had never been present. EEGs showed a hybrid pattern between REM sleep and wakefulness: front regions dimmed, motor cortex active, hemispheric links fragmented. The body functioned. The eye did not. It was as if the driver had been unplugged while the engine kept running. Clinically, it was framed as preservation of autonomic pathways with dissolution of integrated perception. In human terms, it meant the body could obey without knowing whom it served. Neurophysiologists noted how ketamine disrupts NMDA receptors, breaking coherent neural communication, but not entirely. The circuits managing breath, reflexes and balance remained alive. It was the higher mind, the architect of intention, that dissolved. This divide created a natural laboratory of consciousness. At what point does the self begin, and what region must ignite for a gesture to have meaning? Functional MRI scans showed a sharp collapse in activity across the default mode network, the architecture that sustains the narrative of identity. Without that network, movement retained mechanics but lost a subject. Ketamine revealed the mind as a layered structure, one part acting, one observing, one extinguished. Dissociation turned measurable. In anesthesia units, doctors saw it every day. Patients staring blankly, unmoving, yet capable of turning their heads or producing fractured sounds. Upon waking, they remembered nothing. Some spoke of floating above themselves, others recalled metallic echoes or shapeless vibrations. Anesthesiologists understood the mind was not asleep, it was desynchronized. Ketamine shattered the natural rhythm of neural waves, creating a controlled internal chaos that the system misinterpreted as stillness. That stillness lied. Beneath it, synapses fired, muscles obeyed, the heart kept its tempo. It was sleep without sleep. Researchers were captivated because the phenomenon echoed, in miniature, what appears in near-death moments or deep trance states, the body performing while the self is absent. Philosophers pointed to it as empirical evidence that identity is a fragile illusion, sustained by electrical coherence in a few regions. When that harmony breaks, the self evaporates, but the organism endures. Scholars compared the effect to a short circuit between perception and action. The brain continues producing movement, but the inner narrator has gone silent. In animals, the phenomenon looked stark. Rats under ketamine walked a few steps before collapsing. Cats' eyes tracked invisible points. Monkeys opened and closed their hands slowly, unaware of their own mechanics. In humans, it became more unsettling because memory later stitched together disjointed fragments. Floating, a flash, a sound. Science described it with diagrams, but the conclusion carried a strange gravity. The body does not require the self in order to function, only in order to tell a story about its function. Ketamine cleaves those roles with surgical precision. In that suspended gap, the human being meets its rawest nature, a sensitive machine capable of moving, breathing, and standing upright, even when its consciousness has drifted elsewhere. It is the triumph of automatic life over intention, the demonstration that the self is nothing more than a delicate alliance between biology and narrative. Scientists labelled that state an absent presence, and perhaps no phrase captured the era more accurately. Bodies performing routines, minds unplugged, a species drifting through its own life on automatic pilot, and the journey of ketamine toward global saturation did not begin with smugglers in alleyways, but with lab coats under fluorescent light. In the 1990s, while medicine hunted for faster and safer anesthetics, pharmaceutical plants in India and China began manufacturing the compound on an industrial scale. Transparent vials with batch numbers and official seals rolling off conveyor belts, boxed in cardboard marked for medical export, and somewhere between warehouse and dispatch, between port and container yard, the shipment's destiny quietly changed names. Ampules softened into powder, powder rebranded itself as merchandise, merchandise turned into silence. Thus emerged the white dust corridor, an invisible network binding licensed factories, guarded ports, clandestine basements, and the minds that paid for the ride with their own dissociation. Ketamine travelled better than anything else. No smell, no trace, soluble in any liquid, a molecule small enough to pass through borders without waking suspicion. Bottled in Manila, purified in Hong Kong, redistributed in Rotterdam, cut in Mexico City, inhaled in Berlin, what began as anesthesia for soldiers completed a world tour as a mass sedative. In the industrial outskirts of Mumbai or Shenzhen, furnaces glowed through the night, technicians stirring solvents and catalysts in metal drums, while vapour seeped into fabric and lungs. No gloves, no masks, only speed. At dawn, the barrels were loaded into unmarked trucks rolling across fog-soaked highways. At the ports, containers passed through scanners unable to distinguish medicine from contraband. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. In practice, every box belonged to someone invisible. European customs discovered new routes each year. Powder hidden in rice shipments, inside toys, lodged in false panels of furniture. In Latin America, the northern border mutated into a chemical corridor. The substance arrived in heat-sealed envelopes mixed with caffeine or lidocaine, sold in translucent bags beneath club lights. In the 21st century, the route no longer required human couriers, it required servers. Deals organized in encrypted forums, deliveries handled by express couriers, payments routed through cryptocurrency. A new generation of traffickers wore lab coats and monitored Bitcoin charts and ketamine prices with equal precision. The powder moved by plane, ship, and fiber optic cable. No frontier could restrain a molecule so profitable. Each gram carried the same double language: therapy or toxin, cure or erasure. In private clinics, it dripped through IV lines to treat depression. In clubs, it streaked across mirrors to treat reality. The chemical empire thrived in that ambiguity. Governments classified it, banned it, regulated it. Demand only inflated. Hospitals faced shortages, nightclubs faced surpluses, factory villages breathed solvent fumes while wastewater turned grey. Consumer neighbourhoods inhaled neon and forgot their own names. Every corner of the planet participated somehow in the white dust circuit, from the worker sealing a crate in Kolkata to the young man opening it in London to dissolve himself in what he found. Neither knew its origin or destination. Both touched the same substance, the same anesthetized dream moving through the century. Ketamine became the chemical mirror of globalization, a scientific invention drifting freely through the market of emptiness, a drug fast enough to outrun any truth, and, like everything human, indifferent to borders when the entire world sought an elegant method of disappearing. Its recent history contained a map missing from official reports, yet it stretched across oceans with the precision of a line of code. Wherever pharmaceutical oversight was weak and poverty intertwined with necessity, the anesthetic stopped being medicine and turned into merchandise. Across Asia and Latin America, this shift created a parallel economy powered by two universal engines: corruption and desire. Licensed factories, protected by health permits, produced tonnage destined for hospitals, but part of the flow slipped quietly into unmarked channels. A shipment recorded on documents as veterinary supply could end up with intermediaries who transformed it into powder and sold it in the nightlife market. In regions where regulation was more symbolic than real, control reduced itself to paperwork, and the distinction between legal and illicit depended entirely on which seal someone was willing to purchase. There was no conspiracy and no heroism, only survival inside a system that rewarded silence and punished transparency. At the ports, containers merged with ordinary exports and the powder travelled as invisible cargo toward urban centres, where it was reassembled in improvised labs. Globalization handled the rest. Trade routes were identical to those carrying food, textiles, or legitimate medicines. Only purpose and recipient changed. In some countries, ketamine became a recreational refuge for young people, desperate to mute social noise. In others, it became a therapeutic commodity offered by unregulated clinics, promising emotional rebirth through intravenous infusion. That dual identity, escape or remedy, gave the molecule symbolic camouflage. It moved without being fully recognized because in every setting it wore a different name. Governments attempted containment through new classifications, but loopholes and economic incentives kept the doorway open. Behind every vanished vial lay a sequence of choices: an official looking away, a businessman adjusting figures, a transporter avoiding questions, a consumer uninterested in answers. In tourist enclaves where foreign money mingled with spiritual hunger, ketamine discovered a luxury niche: retreats, rituals, and therapeutic journeys staged with sanctified decor, selling inner voyages that looked like enlightenment, but were nothing more than anesthetic episodes dressed in soft linen and warm light. What served as medicine for some became ceremony for others, and pure business for many more, the profitable boundary between science and mysticism blurring until the word psychedelic became a passport capable of laundering any shipment with a smile. Corruption, inequality, and the absence of real economic options filled in the rest of the equation. Doctors siphoning off part of their stock, pharmacists redistributing leftovers, officials pocketing payments not to notice discrepancies. In every corner of the map, the compound adapted to its surroundings, like a resilient invasive species, quiet, enduring, almost impossible to eradicate. What unified it was not a global conspiracy but a shared logic. In societies overwhelmed by noise and frustration, anything promising silence finds a buyer. Thus emerged the countries of forgetting, not determined by geography but by circumstance, places where memory became too heavy and emptiness too profitable. Their ketamine ceased to be a medication and shifted into a chemical metaphor for the century, a reminder that even when everything seems disconnected, someone is always manufacturing oblivion and someone else is always waiting to purchase it. In the 21st century, anesthesia changed costume. It no longer required an operating theatre or a nightclub. All it needed was a camera, a verified account, and an audience eager to believe. This was the birth of the digital opium era, a polished update of the ancient desire to disconnect, with ketamine turned into the perfect emblem of freedom packaged in pixels. Smiling influencers displayed intravenous sessions as if showcasing wellness rights. Hashtags replaced medical pamphlets, and needles became part of curated minimalism. In their posts, detachment glowed in warm tones, accompanied by ambient tracks and phrasing engineered to avoid sounding like drugs. Inner reconnection, neurological reboot, therapy for the soul. The same substance once circulating between ERs and dance floors now appeared on social feeds as if it were an artisanal vitamin for the spirit. The new custodians of emptiness were no longer dealers or physicians but spiritual coaches with in-house labs and experts in emotional marketing. Their invitation was simple and irresistible. Heal without remembering, renew without pain. Thousands of followers responded beneath each post, thanking them, asking about dosages, clinics, promo codes. Anesthesia had become content. Treatment rooms morphed into sets, white walls, strategically placed plants, glass-like IV lines arranged like installations. The procedure became photogenic. No one filmed the tremors, the lingering dissociation, the fractured cognition. Only the afterglow, the blank gaze that algorithms interpreted as serenity. Simultaneously, physicians with influencer aesthetics opened accounts where they promoted customized infusions for anxiety and depression, bundled with discount codes and affiliate links. The line separating mental health and advertising dissolved as effortlessly as ketamine dissolves in a syringe. Science reduced itself to slogans: transform your mind in 40 minutes, awaken inner peace. It was the new emotional capitalism, selling calm in installments, numbing sadness with digital approval. Celebrities normalized it. Actors, models, and CEOs spoke publicly about consciousness expansion, converting a dissociative drug into a lifestyle accessory. Every redemption story came filtered in gold with a motivational caption. Platforms rewarded the vacant look, the expression that neither smiled nor mourned. The anesthetic aesthetic became a trend. What once hid in shadows now stood center stage. The message was unmistakable. Feeling was optional. Equilibrium was a pose. Audiences exhausted by a world of relentless noise welcomed the idea with reverence. Ketamine turned into a lifestyle badge, a membership card for the global congregation of those who claimed to suffer no more. No one spoke of tolerance, dependence, or holes in memory. The narrative revolved around liberation, authenticity, fearless living. Private clinics mastered the grammar of the market. Their advertising abandoned medical logic and embraced redemption arcs. Disconnection sold as empowerment, a modern echo of 19th century opium dens, except the body no longer drifted off on a straw mat but on an ergonomic recliner with a Wi-Fi password. Inner Peace now came with a monthly subscription and a digital certificate. Meanwhile, the oldest question remained unanswered. What is left of a person who learns to shut off the mind at will? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only the reflection of an age that confused quiet with wisdom and anesthesia with freedom. Behind the glass of the new world, everyone smiles with hollow eyes, and the white powder, discreet, elegant, perfectly legal, continues to circulate under ever-changing names. Somewhere along the path, the promise of disconnection shape-shifted into a debt, and what began as a temporary anesthetic became a silent habit, an artful method of disappearing without dying. Doctors labelled it dissociation, users called it relief, but beneath that, manufactured calm lived a price no influencer dared to mention: the cost of emptiness. Hospitals began receiving bodies held upright by rigidity alone, hearts beating with sluggish discipline, pupils locked in glassy stillness, people who kept breathing yet failed to respond, trapped inside an endless pause between awareness and sleep. Some returned without recognizing their own names, others resurfaced only halfway, drifting in a fog where identity dissolved like wet ink. The compound that claimed to silence pain also erased the self. Every dose carried the possibility of a small temporary death, a blackout where the mind vanished and the body kept functioning out of habit. In clinical offices, psychiatrists spoke confidently about neuroplasticity and emotional reconnection, but in hospital corridors, nurses witnessed something less heroic. Patients returning again and again, hunting for the exact second when everything disappears. They weren't seeking healing, they were chasing the privilege of not feeling. Outside, the wellness market continued expanding, selling silence in sterile glass vials, ignoring the biological truth that no human brain was built to unplug on command so frequently. Clinical studies began unveiling memory erosion, speech disruptions, coordination loss, and a strange phenomenon labelled paradoxical anxiety, a polished phrase to disguise the primal fear born when someone turns off their mind one time too many. But warning signs had no place in an industry that worshipped velocity. While medicine debated, commerce marched forward. Each infusion became a transaction, each session a promise of reboot, and no one dared ask what happens when the brain decides it no longer wants to return. In personal testimonies, the refrain repeated itself. I stopped being myself, and it was beautiful. For the first time, I didn't care about anything. It was peace converted into anesthesia, chemical enlightenment for a generation more afraid of suffering than of self-erasure. Some individuals walked, talked, ate, existed, but without any inner anchor. Visible bodies with absent inhabitants, tethered to routine yet severed from life. Ketamine had emptied them with surgical delicacy. Online forums filled with stories of bad trips, of getting stuck in that dissociative void for hours, of watching the world from outside with no way back in. Clinicians referred to it as persistent dissociation. Users described it with brutal clarity. I left, and I'm not certain I came back. The price of emptiness was measured not in money but in distance. Distance between mind and flesh, between memory and silence. In a culture obsessed with productivity, anesthesia became an elegant response to exhaustion, but the brain never forgives a shutdown. Each disconnect leaves a fissure, an invisible crack leaking the sense of reality, and when too many cracks appear, the identity becomes fluid. The human drifts inside their own forgetfulness, convinced that feeling nothing is easier than feeling pain. Ketamine didn't just numb bodies, it numbed an entire era. An age that feared suffering so profoundly, it decided emptiness was a cure, and in reaching for silence, it misplaced the very language with which it once declared itself a self. After decades of controversy, medicine chose not to bury ketamine but to rebrand it. The former military anesthetic responsible for dissociative spirals and blackout nights returned in laboratory attire with a new surname, esketamine, an enantiomer, chemists said, a refined split of the old molecule delivered through nasal spray for treatment-resistant depression. In official announcements, the substance was no longer a drug but a rapid-acting glutamatergic modulator, though behind the clinical vocabulary lingered the same paradox, using an anesthetic to revive those who no longer wish to live. In 2019, the FDA approved the first ketamine-based nasal spray, and the pharmaceutical world erupted with celebration. Stocks surged, patents multiplied, headlines proclaimed a new dawn in psychiatry, the chemical revolution against suicide. Conferences echoed with talk of neuronal plasticity and synapses reigniting like city lights after a blackout. Brain scans showed neural circuits reconnecting, as if science had finally discovered the emotional reset switch. But the miracle carried footnotes. Treatment required medical supervision, exact dosing, safety protocols few could maintain outside a controlled environment. The divide between medicine and mysticism blurred again. Patients described their sessions with language closer to spiritual pilgrimage than pharmacology. I rose out of my body. I watched my pain from afar. I met something that wasn't me, but spoke to me. Psychiatrists called it therapeutic dissociation. Users called it revelation. Pharmaceutical companies quickly recognized the marketing potential. They weren't selling a drug, but an experience. Campaigns advertised guided journeys into your own mind, inner renewal, curated rebirth. Clinics offered infusion bundles with psychological accompaniment, personalized music sets, and branded serenity. Science, in its attempt to heal, slid fully into the territory of ritual. Meanwhile, new companies began producing compounds inspired by ketamine, molecules engineered to mimic its dissociative lift with fewer hallucinations, fewer headlines, fewer moral complications. They were marketed as psychedelic antidepressants, built atop the same timeless promise: immediate relief without confession, without memory, without narrative. What once was taboo became innovation. Silicon Valley invested millions into startups marrying neuroscience with corporate spirituality, convinced that the future of well-being resided in hacking the mind with legal microdoses. Words like expanded consciousness, trauma reprogramming, inward travel filled their presentations as if the human brain were a software suite awaiting the next update. The clinical reports kept insisting there were measurable improvements in some patients. Yet the border separating therapy from commerce grew thinner with every passing month, until science itself began selling experiences that looked suspiciously like belief systems. Under the banner of medicine, people were led into states that resembled visions once attributed to shamans, and psychiatric conferences transformed into gleaming technological sanctuaries, where speakers used the word mystical without a trace of embarrassment. What had been dismissed as madness half a century earlier returned dressed as cutting-edge innovation. Ketamine, polished, renamed and licensed, had accomplished the impossible, cleansing its reputation without altering its essence. It remained the same chemical doorway into oblivion, now wrapped in regulatory approval and corporate logos. Once again, science attempted to domesticate the void, and the void, as usual, responded with a kind of grateful surrender. No one who first administered that fast and inexpensive anesthetic in the mid-20th century could have imagined that 50 years later it would be framed as a key to exploring consciousness. What began as battlefield sedation had opened a landscape so strange that neither psychiatrists nor philosophers possessed vocabulary for it. Modern laboratories no longer aimed solely to soothe pain or alleviate depression. They were trying to understand what it means to inhabit this moment, to be present. Ketamine, with its peculiar gift for extinguishing perception while keeping life intact, became a scientific tool for mapping the edges of the self. In neuroimaging experiments, the volunteers' brains lit up like storms trapped behind bone. NMDA receptors, molecular gates of learning and memory, were blocked, and the glutamatergic system that maintained the cohesion of thought fell into a controlled short circuit. For a handful of minutes, the brain disconnected from its own architecture. Regions that normally cooperated to sustain identity stopped communicating, leaving behind a field of scattered electrical activity with no center and no hierarchy. It was as if the mind were watching itself from the outside. Researchers called it functional dissociation. Mystics called it transcendence. In that suspended interval, reality fractured into drifting fragments, shapes bending in the visual field, time stretching thin, the body relegated to a secondary data point. Then, as the effect lifted, something in the neural network rearranged itself. New synapses formed, weakened connections strengthened, a brain reconfigured to survive the collapse it had just endured. Neurobiologists named this plasticity. Poets would have called it rebirth. But every transformation extracts a cost. Flexibility can arrive at the expense of stability, gains in one direction often paid for in another. Some patients emerge from treatment describing crystalline clarity. Others confess to feeling oddly misaligned, as if their minds no longer fit comfortably inside their bodies. Behind its deceptively simple chemistry, ketamine forced science to revisit its oldest assumption. Consciousness was not a continuous line, but a flickering oscillation between presence and absence. For decades, researchers had measured the mind through binary scales, awake or asleep, rational or delusional, healthy or unwell. Ketamine revealed a wider spectrum, a liminal territory where the self dissolves without vanishing. Inside that uncertain zone, neurology intertwined with metaphysics. Machines recorded what language could not articulate, bursts of electricity replacing experience, flashes lasting less than a heartbeat yet capable of reconfiguring entire lives. The laboratory became a mirror for a modern paradox. To understand the mind, one must break it. Scientists did so carefully, precisely, yet the result remained unsettling. Human consciousness, that system we believe we inhabit with certainty, exposed itself as reversible, malleable, even optional. Ketamine's deepest lesson wasn't merely how to modulate depression, but how to accept that the self is a chemical phenomenon. Once that truth is learned, reality becomes harder to trust. In neuroscience institutes, scanners continue glowing above still heads, hunting for the exact moment when thought stops recognizing itself. Outside, the world turns with the conviction of being awake. Inside, monitors display the century's most uncomfortable revelation. The line between consciousness and anesthesia is as thin as a molecule, as fragile as the notion of identity itself. The human being of this era no longer lives to feel, only to perform. Our language, schedules, and algorithms confirm it. Everything is engineered to keep us alert yet numbed, productive yet hollow. Ketamine didn't invent that trajectory, it simply gave it a chemical face. What once dulled soldiers' screams in makeshift war tents now numbs the wounds of ordinary life. Trauma no longer arrives from combat, but from deadlines, screens, notifications, an endless frontline where anesthesia becomes a method of resistance. Medicine presents it as relief, the market sells it as wellness, culture celebrates it as freedom, but beneath every narrative lies the same act, shutting down. In cities buried under light, noise, and anxiety, the mind longs for silence the way a drowning body gasps for air. Statistics only confirmed what everyone already sensed. Millions of people now relied on tranquilizers, antidepressants, or sedatives as regularly as they scrolled through notifications, except they did it with style, wrapped in the soft vocabulary of self-care, photographed under gentle filters, perfumed with wellness jargon. Anesthesia had become fashionable. On social networks, exhaustion was romanticized, disengagement celebrated, and captions like, "Not feeling is my peace," or "Today I choose not to think," gathered oceans of likes. It wasn't sarcasm, it was diagnosis. Digital burnout had replaced wartime trauma, but the symptoms remained identical: insomnia, dissociation, hopelessness, all manifesting between buzzing alerts. Ketamine, reborn as a shock treatment for depression, found its ideal habitat in a generation uninterested in understanding itself and desperate simply to stop. Patients no longer entered clinics to explore their pain, but to disable it. The intravenous infusion became the medical equivalent of logging out. In 40 minutes the mind dimmed, memories softened, and the body floated in a synthetic calm no algorithm could imitate. Outside, the world continued spinning at hyperspeed. Inside, submerged in the liquid hush of a saline drip, everything seemed briefly meaningful, until the loop started again. Work, exhaustion, anesthesia, reboot. A flawless system for a society needing workers who function, not individuals who feel. Governments reframed mental health as productivity. Companies paid for ketamine sessions as employee benefits. Science aligned itself with the economy of performance. Suffering ceased to be human and became inefficient. Anesthesia, therefore, was not a medical failure but a cultural symptom. We lived in an age that treated sadness as pathology and thoughtfulness as dysfunction. Feeling too much was punished, feeling too little rewarded. In the name of emotional balance, half the planet learned to survive with its intensity turned down to minimum. Pain, once proof of life, had become a system error. That was why ketamine flourished. It offered a pause in a world terrified of stopping, the perfect drug for a civilization wanting to keep moving without the burden of being alive. Beneath every clinical session and every story of emotional rebirth hid the same uncomfortable truth. No one was seeking to heal, everyone was trying to forget. We had transformed anesthesia into lifestyle, emptiness into aspiration, disconnection into identity. The 21st century wasn't asleep, it was sedated, and perhaps that was its real mark of maturity, accepting that clarity hurt more than darkness. Maybe this entire era was nothing but a collective dreamless sleep from which we might someday awaken, if there remains anything to return to. The century opened with promises of constant connection and concluded with millions learning to disconnect with good lighting. The human body no longer chased pleasure or transcendence. only silence. Ketamine became the mirror in which we finally saw ourselves, creatures exhausted by emotion who called freedom the absence of feeling. The anesthetic born for war had mutated into the perfect metaphor for modern peace. No blood, no noise, no thought, just a quiet chemical current imitating serenity. In the name of wellness, we turned emptiness into merchandise, dissociation into therapy, and forgetting into spiritual ambition. Every era has its signature drug. The 19th century had the poets' opium, the 20th the executives' cocaine, the 21st the illuminated classes' ketamine. It was the natural evolution of exhaustion. We no longer ran from pain, only from awareness. The disturbing part wasn't that half the world consumed anesthetics, but that it celebrated them, that disconnection had ceased being a symptom and become an ideal. The brain shut down and we called it meditation. The soul hollowed and we called it balance. Surrounded by constant stimulation, the only authentic experience left was absence. In the end, humanity found what it had always sought, a way to exist without confronting existence. Ancient mystics fasted, modern ones injected. The results were similar, a chemical silence promising answers yet delivering distance. Faith had been replaced by neurochemistry, prayer by intravenous infusion. The science that claimed it wanted to understand the mind ended up engineering its most efficient escape route, and with unsettling irony, it worked. At last we had crafted the perfect drug for a soulless age. Fast, quiet, legal, profitable, delivering neither euphoria nor destruction, only pause. It didn't elevate or inspire, it simply made everything tolerable by blurring it. The long-promised equilibrium had finally arrived. Millions of people balanced, identical, anesthetized. A return to reality, if such a thing still exists, would be unbearable, because reality requires feeling, and feeling has become a luxury we can no longer afford. The full story of ketamine is not the tale of a chemical, but of a civilization that chose to dim itself gracefully. There is no moral ending, no redemption, only the recognition that faced with a world too aware of its own emptiness, humanity selected the simplest solution, to fall asleep with its eyes open.